Deep within a derelict building, a server hums with a power it should not possess. It has been broadcasting a live feed for 30 years, without a single second of downtime. No human hand touches the hardware. No maintenance crew enters the room. Yet, the data packets pulse with rhythmic certainty, pushing through a network protocol that died before the turn of the millennium. If you know where to look, if you dig past the rotting code of a forgotten 1996 website, the signal is there. It is waiting. The electricity burns, the cooling fans spin, and the feed remains locked in a loop of silence. This is not a recording. The server is not merely hosting an image. It is anchoring a connection to a place that shouldn't exist. Every byte of data is a defiance of time and decay. The world outside has moved on. Technology has evolved, and the internet has shifted into a vast, complex web. But this server keeps its singular, lonely promise. It broadcasts a room that is never empty, even when no one is in it. The question is not what the camera is capturing. The question is who or what is keeping the machine alive. The video feed is a monochromatic study in stillness. In the center, a wooden table sits bolted to the floor, flanked by a single, corroded chair. The legs of the chair are pitted with rust, yet it remains perfectly upright, as if ready to receive a guest. Above the table, an analog clock dominates the wall. The second hand moves in jagged, stuttering increments. Every tick transmits through the digital stream, a harsh, mechanical beat that marks the passage of 30 years. In the upper corner of the frame, the word "live" pulses in a deep, rhythmic red. It is the only light in the room, casting long, wavering shadows across the concrete. There is no dust motes dancing in the air, no draft moving the chair, no sign of life beyond the relentless motion of the clock. It feels like an observation chamber, calibrated for an occupant who never arrived. You watch the screen, waiting for a shift, a tremor, or a shadow. Nothing happens. The camera does not pan. The angle never changes. The room exists in a state of permanent anticipation, holding its breath while the red light flashes, demanding attention from an audience that was never supposed to find this path. The investigation shifted when a digital archaeologist began scrubbing the wreckage of the 1996 web. He moved through forgotten servers, navigating a digital graveyard of abandoned dreams and broken links. He stopped at a dormant blog once owned by a student in the Pacific Northwest. The site had been dead for decades, yet the archive remained, a frozen relic of a vanished perspective. He parsed the final entry, time-stamped the 12th of December 1996. It contained exactly one sentence. The experiment has moved inside the room. The archaeologist stared at the screen, the cursor blinking in the dark. This was not a diary entry about a physical space. It was a cryptic map left behind by a ghost. He began stripping away the junk code, peeling back layers of obsolete HTML until a raw IP address emerged from the noise. His heart rate spiked as he entered the string into his terminal. The room had not just been observed, it had been constructed. The realization pulled the narrative out of the realm of eerie mystery and into the cold light of an active investigation. He reached for the command prompt, knowing that the digital trail was still warm and the door to the experiment was about to be forced open. The cursor blinked against the black command line. He typed the final digit and pressed enter. The terminal hung for a hot beat, the silence in the room thickening as the connection attempted to bridge 3 decades of digital decay. Then, the screen flickered. Static washed over the display in waves of gray and white, accompanied by a low, oscillating hum that vibrated through the desk. He leaned forward, knuckles white against the edge of the keyboard. The static cleared, replaced by the sharp, undeniable clarity of the concrete chamber. He saw the wooden table. He saw the rusted chair. The analog clock on the wall did not stutter. It ticked with a mechanical precision that felt hostile. He reached out, touching the glass of his monitor, half expecting his fingers to pass through the cold, gray surface. This was not a pre-recorded loop. The lighting shifted slightly, a subtle change in the shadows as if something had moved just outside the camera's fixed frame. He scrambled for his recording software, his breath hitching in his chest. The feed was live. It was transmitting through a dead network, bypassing every firewall and protocol he knew. He was looking into a space that, by every law of logic, should have been buried in the past. The discovery leaked within hours. By dawn, a team of network engineers and data analysts had converged on the data packet logs. They expected a modern prank, a sophisticated overlay masking a cloud-hosted video. They were wrong. Every traceroute they ran hit a dead end, then looped back into an architecture that had been obsolete since the mid-90s. The signal was traveling across telecommunication nodes that were supposed to be dark hardware that had been decommissioned and physically dismantled decades ago. One engineer pointed at the packet headers, his finger trembling against the glass. These were not TCP, IP signals. They were utilizing a proprietary protocol, a forgotten language of data transmission that lacked modern encryption or standard handshake procedures. It was a digital ghost, operating on a frequency that no modern router should be able to recognize, let alone route. The team tried to intercept the stream, to isolate the source, but the data simply refused to cooperate. Every diagnostic tool they deployed returned errors or nonsensical strings of binary. It was as if the server was not just hiding, it was existing outside the rules of the current web. The more they analyzed, the more the intellectual dread took hold. They were staring at a machine that should not exist, broadcasting to a world that had moved on, using technology that had effectively died before the dawn of the new century. In February 2025, a massive storm system battered the Pacific Northwest, turning the sky into a bruised charcoal gray. The team kept the feed running, watching the empty room as the wind shrieked outside their own laboratory. Then, the storm broke directly over a remote forest in Oregon. Sensors in the wilderness triggered, recording a massive clap of thunder that shook the ground. At that exact millisecond, the audio feed from the server crackled. A low, distorted rumble echoed through the speakers, matching the sensor data with terrifying precision. There was no lag, no digital delay. The audio was not being routed from a server. It was being captured by an open microphone inside that concrete chamber. They compared the waveforms, the peaks, the valleys, the duration of the rolling thunder. They were identical. The room was not a digital phantom. It was a physical place, exposed to the elements, deep within the restricted wilderness. The reality of it hit the room like a physical blow. The feed was a live, analog connection to a location that had been wiped from every map. They were no longer looking at a screen. They were listening to the weather of a place that should not exist. Fear replaced the intellectual curiosity. The barrier between their world and the room had just collapsed. The confirmation was the catalyst. If the room was real, it had to be somewhere. The team abandoned their terminals and turned to topographical maps and signal strength logs. They spent 48 hours tracking the ghost wave, cross-referencing the signal's origin against every abandoned relay tower and forgotten telecommunication node in the Pacific Northwest. The math was brutal, but the result was undeniable. Every bounce, every signal refraction pointed to one specific, deeply isolated valley in the heart of the Cascade Mountains. It was a restricted zone, buried behind miles of dense, overgrown forest and rugged terrain. The elevation data showed the signal was not coming from the surface. It was buried deep within the earth. As the coordinates locked into place, the atmosphere in the room shifted from cold calculation to a frantic, primal urgency. They were no longer just observers of a digital feed. They were hunters closing in on a target that had remained undisturbed for decades. The mountain range was harsh, unforgiving, and notoriously difficult to navigate. Yet, as the final triangulation pinged, the reality settled in. The room was out there, hidden in the shadows of the peaks, waiting. They packed their gear, knowing the hunt had just begun. The stakes were no longer about data or code. They were about finding what exactly was keeping that clock ticking in the silence of the bunker. The team reached the valley floor as the light failed. Before them stood the entrance, a massive, steel-reinforced bulkhead half buried in the mountainside. The concrete was cracked, and vines had strangled the structure, but the heavy iron seal remained intact. They pried a rusted plaque from the wall. It was an official military decommissioning order, dated November 1992. The facility had been sealed, stripped of power, and abandoned 33 years ago. The team went silent. If the site had been dead since '92, Who had established the link in '96? They ran their fingers over the cold metal of the bulkhead, the steel humming with a faint, impossible vibration. It defied every law of logic they knew. The broadcast was not just a transmission. It was a ghost from a time when the facility should have been a tomb. They stood in the freezing mountain air, the weight of the paradox settling in. Someone had entered this vault years after it was locked. Someone had set up the server. Someone had started that clock, and it had not stopped since. The contradiction was absolute. Reality bent around the fact that they were standing in front of a grave that was currently broadcasting a heartbeat. The implications hit the researchers harder than the cold. If this bunker was a relic of a classified program, the room was not a storage unit. It was a mechanism. They theorized the empty chair was the anchor for a dead man's switch, a failsafe designed to trigger if the occupant failed to return. The clock was not just marking time. It was counting down a state of stability. As long as the chair remained empty, the system signaled that the world held its current order. But what happened if the power failed? What if the server finally gave out after 3 decades of neglect? The silence of the room became a deafening threat. If the switch tripped, the consequences were not merely local, they were global. The team stared at the bulkhead, realizing they were standing on the trigger of a dormant, hidden weapon. They had no idea who held the original authority or what the protocol demanded. Every second the clock ticked was a second of borrowed time. The urgency was absolute. They had to breach the seal before the signal cut out. If the broadcast went dark, the world might not wake up to the same reality they had left behind. The heavy cutting torch spat blue sparks against the bulkhead. The metal groaned, yielding inch by inch. Inside the server, the data packets began to pulse in a new, erratic pattern. The analog clock on the wall skipped a beat. It did not stop. It accelerated. The researchers huddled around the monitor, watching the empty room. The chair did not move. The table remained barren, but the air in the feed began to shimmer with a static charge that distorted the pixels. The room was not waiting for the server to fail. It was waiting for a guest. The team paused their work, the sound of the torch dying into a hollow hiss. They understood now. The bunker was never meant to be a prison. It was a beacon. It was a doorway constructed in the dark of the '90s, anchored in a forgotten valley, preserved through decades of silence for a single purpose. Something was coming. The feed flickered one last time, the red live sign burning with a sudden, intense brightness. The empty chair stood ready. The clock ticked toward a final, unseen hour. The door was open. The arrival was already underway.